The year was 1886, and the wind across the eastern Colorado plains had already begun to speak of winter. It was a language Elspeth Finch understood intimately, a dialect of stripped branches and dust devils that promised a deep and unforgiving cold. Autumn was a fleeting, brittle thing here, a brief exhalation between the scorching breath of summer and the iron lung of the freeze. Her late husband, Thomas, had called this land a place of honest extremes, a description Elspeth now found to be a profound understatement. Their claim was a lonely square of brown grass and sky, punctuated by the sagging lines of their soddy, and, 50 yards from the door, the circular scar of a dry well. It was this well, a failed hope from the previous summer, that now held her complete attention, drawing her gaze more insistently than the failing roof over her head. Elspeth was a widow, a title that felt as ill-fitting and coarse as burlap. Thomas had been taken by a fever in the spring, a swift and merciless illness that had stolen the architect of their future and left her with only the half-finished blueprint. He had been a man of books and principles, a geologist by training who had come west possessed by the farmer's dream, believing he could apply scientific understanding to the stubborn soil. Now, his books sat in a wooden crate, and the principles he had so often explained to her were all that remained of his voice. She was left with their 2 children, 9-year-old Samuel and 6-year-old Clara, and a sod house that was slowly surrendering to gravity and moisture. The walls wept a fine, dark silt after every rain, and the roof, a lattice of scavenged cottonwood branches and packed earth, had begun to bow ominously in the center. Her neighbors, the few souls scattered across the vast emptiness, saw her predicament with a mixture of pity and practicality. They saw the failing soddy and advised her to patch it, to spend these last precious weeks reinforcing what was already there. But Elspeth saw something different. She saw a structure fundamentally flawed for the environment it occupied. The soddy was a surface dwelling, a thin skin of earth and grass fully exposed to the relentless, soul-stealing wind. Patching it felt like mending a sieve. Her gaze kept returning to the well. It was 30 feet deep, dug through clay and shale until the drillers had given up, defeated by solid rock. It was a cylinder of failure, a monument to miscalculation. But to Elspeth, recalling Thomas's quiet lectures on thermodynamics, it was something else entirely. It was a shaft driven deep into the Earth's memory, a place below the reach of the wind, a place that held the steady, settled temperature of the deep ground. This was where she would make her stand against the winter, not on the windswept surface, but within the earth itself. The work began not with a shovel, but with a rope and a bucket. Her decision had been made in the quiet of a sleepless night, listening to the wind clawing at the soddy's walls. The next morning, she said nothing to the children, for she had no words to explain the magnitude of the task or the strangeness of the idea. She simply knotted the thick hemp rope her husband had used for hauling equipment around the sturdy, half-buried rock that served as the well's anchor stone, and prepared to descend. Samuel watched her, his face a small, tight mask of concern. He was old enough to understand risk, but too young to comprehend the principle that drove her. He saw his mother preparing to lower herself into a dark, abandoned hole, and his fear was a palpable thing. Elspeth paused, coiling the rope in her calloused hands, and looked at him. "The earth is a blanket, Samuel," she said, her voice calm and even. "We just need to learn how to pull it over our heads." The boy did not understand, but he saw the certainty in her eyes and fell silent. Her first descent was into a column of cool, still air that smelled of damp clay and stone. It was a startling contrast to the gusting wind at the surface. Down she went, her boots finding rough purchase on the well's uneven walls until she touched the bottom. It was a cramped, debris-strewn circle not much wider than her shoulders. For 2 days, she did nothing but haul out the detritus of its abandonment. Loose rock, sun-baked clods of earth, a desiccated snake, and the rusted head of a broken shovel. She filled the bucket, signaled to Samuel, and he would walk the rope away from the wellhead, his small frame straining as he dragged the load to the surface. It was a slow, arduous rhythm of descent, labor, and ascent. The community, what little of it existed, soon took notice. A thin plume of dust rising from the abandoned well was an oddity, and oddities traveled fast on the plains, carried on the same wind that carried the seeds of the tumbleweed. Hiram Poole was the first to arrive, riding his mule over the low rise to the west. He was a stern, practical man who had tamed his own square of the prairie through sheer force of will and an unshakable faith in proven methods. He saw Elspeth, smudged with dirt and sweat, standing beside the growing pile of debris next to the well. He dismounted, his expression one of profound confusion. "Mrs. Finch," he began, his voice devoid of preamble. "Dorothea sent me. She was worried. What in God's name are you doing?" Elspeth wiped her brow with the back of her arm, leaving a muddy streak across her forehead. "I'm cleaning out the well, Mr. Poole." His eyes narrowed, scanning the landscape for a new water source she might be trying to reach. He saw none. "It's a dry hole, Elspeth. You know that. Thomas himself said so. You'll find no water there." She met his gaze directly, her own eyes clear and steady. "I'm not looking for water," she stated simply. "I'm looking for shelter." The silence that followed was heavy with Hiram's disbelief. He stared at the hole in the ground, then back at her, as if trying to reconcile her words with the evidence of his senses. He was a man who understood houses. Houses were made of wood or sod. They had walls and roofs and windows. They stood on the ground, not in it. "A hole in the ground is a grave, Mrs. Finch, not a house," he said, his tone softening slightly with what he imagined was gentle reason. "This is folly. The grief has unsettled you. Your soddy needs work. Let me help you with the roof. We can have it braced and repacked before the first snow. Wasting your strength on this burrow," he trailed off, shaking his head. His logic was sound, built upon the shared experience of every settler on that plain. He saw a grieving woman engaged in a nonsensical, desperate act. He could not see the principle she was following, the hidden knowledge that guided her hands. Elspeth tried to explain. It was a mistake, she knew, even as she started. Watching an outcome is not the same as understanding the principle, and Hiram was a man of outcomes. "The wind is what kills," she began, her voice patient. "It scours the heat from every surface. But 10 feet down, the earth doesn't feel the wind. It holds a steady temperature. It's warmer than the winter air and cooler than the summer sun. This well is a shaft into that stillness." Hiram Poole listened with a pained expression, his skepticism hardening into certainty. He had heard the ravings of sun-touched prospectors and the strange philosophies of men who had spent too long alone. This sounded like more of the same. "Earth is cold," he countered flatly. "Deeper earth is colder. That's common sense. You'll freeze down there. You'll catch a lung sickness from the damp. You are putting those children at risk." His words were meant to be a sharp, corrective dose of reality, but to Elspeth, they were merely the echoes of a world she was trying to escape. She nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the gulf between them. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Poole," she said, turning back to her work. "But my mind is made up." Hiram left, his shoulders stiff with disapproval. The story of Finch's folly became the prevailing narrative. Dorothea Poole arrived a few days later with a basket of bread and a heavy shawl of pity. She spoke of Elspeth's terrible loss and the burden she carried. She offered to take the children for a few weeks, to give Elspeth time to come to her senses. Constance Hartwell, a widow herself who lived 2 miles to the south, came as well. But she came without advice. She watched for a long while as Elspeth used a hand spade to painstakingly widen the base of the well, sending up bucket after bucket of dense clay. Constance saw not madness, but a desperate, focused industry. She saw a woman who was not flailing, but building. "It is a great deal of work," Constance said, her voice quiet and observant. "Yes," Elspeth replied, not breaking her rhythm. "But it is the right work." Constance nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. She did not understand the plan, but she recognized the conviction behind it, and that was something she could respect. Elspeth's internal world during this time was filled with the memory of her husband. She recalled a winter evening in their first year on the claim, huddled around the stove in the half-built soddy, the wind shrieking outside. Thomas had picked up a cold potato from their dinner stores. "Feel this," he had said. "It's cold, yes, but it's not frozen." The crate was in the root cellar, 6 feet down. Outside, the water in the bucket is solid ice. The air is 10 degrees below freezing. But the earth beneath us, Elspeth, the great mass of it, it holds its warmth. It's a vast reservoir of thermal energy, a battery charged by the summer sun. He had tapped the dirt floor. We live on the skin of the world, subject to every whim of the atmosphere. But the world itself is deep and slow and constant. That's the principle. Thermal mass. It resists rapid change. At the time, it had been an interesting abstraction. Now, it was the cornerstone of her survival. She wasn't digging a hole, she was accessing the battery. She was tapping into the deep, slow constancy Thomas had spoken of. The second phase of the work was to secure the chamber she was digging at the bottom of the well. She had widened it into a small, irregular room, roughly 8 feet in diameter, with a ceiling just high enough for her to stand upright in the center. The clay walls were solid, but she feared they might slump with moisture over time. For a week, she and the children made trips to a shallow, dry creek bed a half-mile away, gathering flat, sedimentary stones. She loaded them onto a crude travois Samuel helped her build, and they dragged them back to the well. Lowering the stones was a dangerous, painstaking process. She wrapped each one in a burlap sack tied to the rope and carefully guided it down, stacking them against the earthen walls of her subterranean room. She packed mud and clay into the gaps, creating a rough but solid retaining wall. It was the work of a stonemason, learned through trial and error, her hands raw and her back screaming with protest by the end of each day. The final and most critical part of the construction was the roof. A simple cover would not do. It had to be an insulated barrier, strong enough to hold the weight of snow and sealed tightly against the wind. For materials, she dismantled the remains of a small, collapsed lean-to that had stood against the soddy. The timber was old and weathered, but the main beams were still sound. She sawed them to size, her muscles burning with the unfamiliar effort, and laid them across the well opening, creating a sturdy framework. On top of this, she layered thick bunches of dried prairie grass, followed by the salvaged planks from the lean-to's walls. The final layer was the most important. She cut fresh bricks of sod, dense with tangled roots, and laid them carefully over the entire structure, packing them tightly together. She then shoveled loose earth over the sod, meticulously filling every crack and seam, until the roof was a low, seamless mound, barely distinguishable from the surrounding prairie. She left only two openings, a small square hole for a trapdoor she fashioned from the last of the planks, and a smaller circular opening for a stovepipe. She had traded their large, inefficient cast-iron stove for a neighbor's smaller, pot-bellied version, a trade that had earned her more pitying glances. The small stove was light enough for her to lower into the chamber, with the help of the rope and Samuel's slight counterweight. She wrestled it into a corner of the stone-lined room and carefully fitted the lengths of stovepipe, running them up the well shaft and through the dedicated opening in the roof. The seal around the pipe was packed with clay to make it airtight. When it was done, she stood in the center of her creation, the only light filtering down from the open trapdoor above. The air was cool and still, the silence profound. It felt less like a house and more like a tomb, and for a fleeting moment, Hiram Poole's words echoed in her mind. But then she placed her hand against the earthen wall. It was cool, but it was a living cool, the deep, neutral temperature of the earth itself. It was a blank slate, waiting for the small addition of heat that would make it a home. They moved their essential belongings into the well house just as the first frosts began to harden the ground. The transfer was a somber procession: 2 thin mattresses, a crate of potatoes and dried beans, Thomas's books, a few cooking pots, and their winter clothes. The soddy was left to its fate, a hollow shell already beginning to crumble. The children were quiet, their initial excitement at the novelty of a secret fort having given way to a nervous uncertainty. To them, they were leaving a home, however flawed, for a dark hole. Elspeth understood their fear. She lit a lantern, and its soft glow pushed back the shadows, revealing the texture of the stone walls and the familiar patterns on their quilts. She lit a small, carefully measured fire in the stove. The dried dung and cottonwood twigs caught quickly, and a gentle, radiating warmth began to fill the small space. It was not a roaring heat, but a subtle, pervasive comfort that seemed to seep into their bones. The stovepipe drew perfectly, pulling the smoke up and out without a hint of leakage. The test came sooner than she had expected. The sky one afternoon turned a bruised metallic gray, and the wind, which had been a constant companion, fell into an eerie silence. The air grew heavy and cold, a cold that felt sharp and crystalline in the lungs. Elspeth had seen a sky like this once before and knew what it meant. "Samuel, Clara," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Bring the water buckets inside. We're closing the door." They scurried to obey, their faces pale. She checked her small pile of fuel, dried cow and buffalo chips collected over months, and a small stack of precious wood. She secured the trapdoor from the inside, fitting it snugly into its frame and sliding a heavy wooden bar into place. And then, the world outside vanished. The sliver of gray sky was gone, replaced by the rough-hewn planks of the door. The silence was absolute. There was only the soft hiss of the fire in the stove and the sound of their own breathing. They were adrift in a sea of earth. For the first few hours, the children were restless, but the profound quiet and the gentle, steady warmth soon had a soporific effect. They fell asleep, huddled together on their mattress. Elspeth stayed awake, tending the fire. She did not need a large blaze. That was the mistake surface dwellers made. They built huge fires to fight the immense cold outside, constantly battling the drafts and the heat loss through thin walls. Here, she was not fighting the outside world. She was sealed off from it. The ambient temperature of the earth around them was perhaps 50 degrees. Her small fire only needed to raise that temperature by 15 or 20 degrees to create a comfortable, livable space. A large fire would dangerously consume their precious oxygen. She fed the stove one chip at a time, keeping the flames low and steady, a master of her small, closed system. Sometime in the night, a faint, deep thrumming began, a vibration that seemed to travel through the very ground itself. It was the wind, the great blizzard wind, but it was a sound felt more than heard. On the surface, it would have been a deafening, terrifying roar, a physical assault that tore at roofs and buried landmarks. Down here, it was a muted, distant hum, the sound of a battle being fought in another country. There were no drafts, no rattling windows, no whistling cracks in the walls. There was only the unyielding solidity of the earth around them. Elspeth sat in the lantern light, listening to that distant roar, and felt a profound sense of peace. She had not conquered the storm. She had simply sidestepped it. She had refused to fight on its terms. She had found a place it could not reach. They remained in the well for 3 days. Time became a fluid thing, measured only by the cycles of sleeping, eating, and tending the fire. Elspeth read to the children from one of Thomas's books, a dry text on geology, but she edited as she went, turning the descriptions of strata and sedimentation into a story about the layers of time that held them safe. She spoke of the earth as a protector, a great, slow creature whose embrace was proof against the fleeting fury of the sky. The children, cocooned in warmth and security, listened, their earlier fears forgotten. They were living inside a principle, and while they didn't know the words for it, they understood its truth in the most fundamental way. They were warm, they were safe, and the monster outside could not get in. On the morning of the 4th day, Elspeth awoke to a different quality of silence. The deep thrumming had stopped. The air in the chamber felt unchanged, the fire still glowed softly, but the sense of immense external pressure was gone. She waited another hour, then extinguished the lantern to conserve oil. "I'm going to open the door," she said quietly. Samuel sat up, his eyes wide. She stood on a small crate and pushed upwards on the trap door. It resisted. For a heart-stopping moment, she feared they were buried, trapped. Then she put her shoulder into it and pushed with all her strength. With a soft whoosh and a cascade of fine powder, the door gave way, swinging open to reveal a sky of impossible, blinding blue. The light that flooded the shaft was dazzling, and the air that followed it was a physical shock. It was a clean, thin, brutally cold air, so different from the humid warmth of their shelter that it felt like diving into an icy lake. Elspeth hoisted herself up and out, shielding her eyes against the glare. The world was gone. In its place was a new landscape, a rolling, sculpted desert of white. The snow was piled in immense, wind-carved drifts, some as tall as a man. Of her soddy there was almost no sign, just a low, rounded hump from which a single, crooked roof beam protruded like a broken bone. The vast, featureless expanse was utterly silent, the air perfectly still. The storm had scoured the world clean and left behind this pristine, frozen emptiness. And in the middle of it all, a faint wisp of smoke curled from a small iron pipe sticking out of a snow-covered mound. She stood there for a long time, breathing in the fierce, clean cold, feeling the profound difference between the world at the surface and the world she had created just a few feet below. The principle had held. Thermal mass, insulation, separation from the wind. It was not magic, it was physics. The same reliable principles that governed the slow cooling of a star or the orbit of the moon. Thomas would have been proud. He had believed that understanding the world was the key to living in it, not just upon it. She felt a quiet, internal click of connection, the satisfying alignment of theory, action, and outcome. It was not a feeling of triumph over the storm, but of harmony with the deeper truths of her environment. Later that day, she saw a figure moving slowly across the snow from the west. It was Hiram Poole, on foot, his mule presumably unable to navigate the deep drifts. He was making his way toward the misshapen lump of her old soddy, his movements heavy with effort and, she suspected, grim purpose. He likely expected to find them frozen, a tragic and predictable end to Finch's folly. He stopped at the ruined sod house, calling her name, his voice thin in the vast silence. He circled it, his shoulders slumping. He was about to turn back when he saw it, the thin trail of smoke rising from the snow nearby. He stared at it, his head cocked in confusion. It was impossible. There was nothing there but a drift. "Mrs. Finch?" he called out again, his voice now laced with disbelief. From the center of the drift, a figure rose, as if from the ground itself. It was Elspeth, her face framed by the hood of her coat. "We're here, Mr. Poole," she said. Hiram struggled through the deep snow to the mound, his face a mask of astonishment. He peered down into the dark opening from which she had emerged. You are alive," he stammered. "You are all right?" "We are warm and well fed," Elspeth replied calmly. "Would you care to come down?" He hesitated for only a moment before swinging his legs over the edge and climbing down the notched log she had placed as a ladder. He emerged into the small, warm, lamp-lit chamber. The air was 20, perhaps 30 degrees warmer than the surface. He saw the children, looking healthy and calm, sitting on a mattress playing with carved wooden figures. He saw the small stove giving off its gentle heat. He saw the stone walls, the earthen floor, the neatly stacked supplies. He ran a hand over the cool, smooth clay of the wall, then held it in the warm air radiating from the stove. The contrast was a physical argument more powerful than any words. He had just fought his way through a landscape of brutal, life-threatening cold. Here, in a hole in the ground, was a pocket of impossible warmth and stillness. He looked at Elspeth, and the certainty and condescension were gone from his eyes, replaced by a profound and humbling respect. He, with his sturdy cabin and his conventional wisdom, had spent the last 3 days feeding a roaring fire just to keep the cold at bay. His family huddled in the one room they could keep from freezing. He had burned through a quarter of his winter wood. Elspeth, with her madness and her folly, had weathered the same storm in quiet comfort, using a handful of dried dung. "I'll be," he said, his voice low and heavy with the weight of his misjudgment. "I never would have believed it, not in 100 years." He looked around the small chamber again, not at a grave, but at a miracle of common sense. He met her eyes. "You were right, Mrs. Finch. I was wrong." That admission, spoken in the quiet earth, was the true end of the storm. In the weeks that followed, as the community dug itself out and counted its losses, livestock frozen in their pens, meager stores of food ruined in poorly insulated cellars, the story of Finch's folly was retold. It was no longer a tale of a widow's grief-stricken madness, but one of her quiet genius. Hiram Poole became her unlikely champion, describing the impossible warmth of the well house to anyone who would listen. People came to see it, at first out of curiosity, and then with a genuine desire to understand. Elspeth, patient and clear-eyed, explained the principle to them, just as she had tried to explain it to Hiram. She did not speak of thermal mass or thermodynamics, but of the wind and the deep earth. She told them how the earth was a blanket. This time, they listened. The following year, 2 more families dug storm shelters based on her design. They became known as finch cellars. They were not meant for full-time living, but as refuges during the blizzards that were a brutal certainty of life on the plains. Elspeth helped them design the roofs, showing them how to lay the timbers and pack the sod to create a perfect seal against the wind. She taught them the art of the small fire, the principle of maintaining, not fighting. She gave her knowledge away as freely as Thomas had given it to her, understanding that a principle was not a possession, but a truth to be shared. She never moved back into a surface dwelling. The well house remained her home for many years, a place of quiet, subterranean security. Her children grew up with the unique understanding that a home was not about the height of its walls, but the soundness of its principle. Decades later, long after Elspeth was gone, and the open range had been carved into fenced-off farms, the low mound of her original shelter was still visible on the landscape. The wooden trapdoor had rotted away, but the stone-lined chamber below remained, a cool refuge in the summer and a place out of the wind in the winter. The story was passed down through generations, becoming a piece of local lore. It was the story of the widow Finch, who, when abandoned by fortune and faced with an impossible winter, had turned away from the sky and put her faith in the earth. She had listened to the quiet, constant wisdom of the ground beneath her feet, and, in doing so, had taught a whole community a new way to survive. Her legacy was not built of wood or stone, but of knowledge, the simple, profound idea that sometimes the safest place to be is not the one you build up, but the one you dig down.